Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos Ribbits, and I hope that by listening to this episode, the cares that hung around you through the week will vanish like a gambler's lucky streak. And if you think this is a cheeky opening, you're half right, because it's a cheek-to-cheeky opening. Well, what's the old man talking about this week? A very good question. Well, I hope you will have recognised a quotation from one of the songs which I think is the song most synonymous with the incredible dance partnership of Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire, who made 10 films together, 9 of which were made between 1933 and 1939, and then there was a reunion in 1949, called The Berkeleys of Broadway. Now, I think you'd have to go a long way to find someone who didn't think that Ginger and Fred were the epitome of 1930s film musicals, in what was actually quite an incredible decade for the genre of film musicals. It was reinvented at the beginning of that decade by Busby Berkeley, and Ginger Rogers was involved in the first 2 of his films, that's 42nd Street and Gold Diggers of 1933, and then in a happy accident she was paired with Fred Astaire in Flying Down to Rio, where they played the secondary couple, but they stole that film from under the 2 stars and then were snapped up to make a series of films which, as I say, numbered 10 in total by the time it finally finished in 1949. And so Ginger Rogers is already an incredible person to talk about just because of her film career in relation to film musicals, starting out with Busby Berkeley and then going into the RKO films with Fred Astaire. She is the person more than anyone who I think encapsulates 1930s film musicals. But there's much more to Ginger Rogers than just musicals, because she was also an incredible film actress in what we might call straight roles, but also in comic roles. She was an amazingly talented woman, and she quite rightly won the Academy Award in 1940 for her performance in Kitty Foyle. So Ginger Rogers is definitely someone worth talking about, and so I'm delighted to say over the next 2 weeks of Musical Talk, we'll be talking in depth about her career, looking at it broadly, which shows off her enormous versatility and talent, but of course we'll be focusing particularly on that first decade of the 1930s, which was the period of her career when she was concentrating on musical films, although not exclusively. And it's not just Musical Talk that wants to talk about the incredible legacy and career of Ginger Rogers, because the British Film Institute, the BFI, is running a Ginger Rogers film series, opening very soon after the time of publication of this episode, running all the way through April. It's called Ginger Rogers All That Sass. And the curator of the film series, Heather Osborne, has said, if there was anyone you'd want to paint the town with, that's the glamorous make-believe tinsel town of the Depression-hit 1930s, it will be Ginger Rogers, the sassiest gal in Hollywood. And she goes on to describe her in the following way. Like her fellow wisecracking trooper Lucille Ball, Rogers learned her craft in a string of early shorts and B-movies, and wasn't afraid of hard work or appearing unglamorous. Although she became a star through her celebrated dance partnership with Fred Astaire, no other woman in Hollywood moved between musical comedy, straight comedy and dramatic roles with such ease, or played each so convincingly. Rogers won an Academy Award for Kitty Foyle and excelled in portraying strong, unbreakable women. These were characteristics ingrained within herself and most certainly inherited from her fiercely independent mother, a significant presence in her career. There was also that mischievous, deft comic timing, which was present in all Rogers movies. So, to quote a later version of Roxy Hart, which we all know as Chicago, "Come on, babe, why don't we paint the town?" And all that sass. It promises to be a fabulous film series, and I can't tell you how excited I am because I shall be going to quite a number of the film showings. There are also talks and, indeed, a course about the career of Ginger Rogers, and I'll be giving you more details about those at the end of this episode. But let's get down to today's business. Now, I had the real pleasure of meeting film historian and curator Miles Eady only recently to talk about Ginger Rogers and her extraordinary career, but with a particular emphasis on her film musical career, particularly in the 1930s and her 1949 return to musicals, the Berkeleys of Broadway. Now, Miles was a fabulous man to meet because he knows everything and is a great conversationalist. We hit it off immediately, as I think you'll hear in this week and next week's episodes. So, let's get this show on the road with the first half of a conversation I had with Miles about the incredible career of Ginger Rogers. I'm absolutely certain you'll enjoy this episode. Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast.
So I'm Miles Eady, and I'm a writer and curator. I love musicals. Film musicals are my particular passion and area of expertise. And I'm here today to talk about the Ginger Rogers season, All That Sass, which is coming up over the next few weeks, where we will be showing not just the musicals of Ginger Rogers at the BFI, but films that show Rogers' wider career as a dramatic and comic actor.
Now, that's brilliant because actually that's something I very much want to touch on. She will be known to most people as the Ginger of Fred and Ginger, or sometimes the Ginger of Ginger and Fred. They both options are used, but it's usually Fred and Ginger. And she's also known, of course, as in those early Busby Berkeleys, 42nd Street, Gold Diggers, 1933. But her career expands so much more than that. And that's why I think the title of this series of films is so clever. Ginger Rogers, All That Sass. Now, you must tell me if I've got my working wrong here, but All That Sass, of course, says to me, or is very evocative of the song All That Jazz from Chicago. Chicago is the story of Roxy Hart. Roxy Hart, of course, is one of the great non-musical films that Ginger Rogers was in, and on which the Chicago musical is based later on. And so you very cleverly, with that title, sort of, I think, shown the gamut from both. It evokes both musicals and her non-musical career. And that is the secret of this film sequence, isn't it? That it's going to illustrate the breadth and range and length of her career in many senses.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think there's been a lot of very clever thought gone into the title. All of those references are absolutely there. Apart, of course, from the tap dance she does on the staircase in Roxy Hart, which is a little bit musical. It kind of breaks out. But I think by that point, that's a nod, isn't it, to her star power, that the audience would have known her as a sort of musicals performer. So it was a bit of a wink at the audience. But you're absolutely right. So Rogers makes, I think, 79 films in her career. And only 10 of those are 12 of them are musicals. 10 are with Fred Astaire, and then you have 42nd Street, 1933, and Gold Diggers of 33, also 1933. And throughout her time filming with Fred, so that's between only 1933 and 1939, it's a period of just 6 years.
Yes.
Fred Astaire makes one film that isn't with Ginger, which is A Damsel in Distress, 1937. And during that time, Ginger makes 12 other films without Fred. So her star power was very different to Fred's. There's this incredible phrase that I love in the Esther Williams quotes in her incredibly entertaining biography, which says that star power is like wet cement. And when it's new, you can mould it and it's malleable. Well, once it's dried, it's stuck. And by the time Astaire is making his first movie, which is Dancing Lady in 1933 for MGM,
with Joan Crawford, I think.
Joan Crawford and Clark Gable, yeah. Not necessarily Fred's best dance partner.
I think we can agree on this.
Yeah. He has a massive name. He's been a huge Broadway and London star. And he is always nonchalant and debonair, and he's the man in white tie and tails. And that's what's expected of him when he hits the screen. But Ginger has had a contract with Paramount since, I think, 1930, maybe slightly before. And she's been making films for all that time. Now, in their first film, together, which is Flying Down to Rio, where they perform memorably the karaoke together, the start of a 10-film sequence, she's the one who knows how cameras work and filming works. And she's the one who says to Fred, you hit your mark here, this is how you look at the camera, don't look down the lens or what have you. And it's a quite interesting power dynamic between the two of them that she's helping him out. And it's that sort of detail that's missed, I think, in the telling of the Ginger Rogers story, that she is 12 years Fred's junior and hasn't actually cemented her screen persona, but she's the veteran in the film.
Isn't that interesting?
It's really interesting. And when you think of Fred's very first appearance, so it's quite funny. I didn't see Dancing Lady for many, many years. I knew it existed, and then I watched it. And I was shocked by how much like Fred Astaire is in his very first screen appearance. So he doesn't know he's going to go on to make, 25 incredible musicals, ending up at the Freed Unit, starting in black and white, ending up in glorious Technicolor in 1957.
And stereophonic sound.
And stereophonic sound. You knew where I was going with that.
I did. Do you like my stockings?
Well, are they made of nylon or are they made of silk?
They are silk, yes.
But the thing is that it's shocking, weirdly, to see how much like his final film musical appearances he is in his very first one. He doesn't develop or change.
No.
Now, that's no bad thing. We love Fred in White Tie and Tails. We love the debonair. And he's 33, I think, maybe 34, when he makes his first film appearance. And he's sort of the finished article. Whereas Ginger, if we scroll back to the Busby Berkeley movies, Ginger's screen persona changes between those two films. So 42nd Street is different to how she is in Gold Diggers of 33.
Yes.
Which is different from how she is in all the Fred and Ginger movies. And people kind of lump the Fred and Ginger movies together as if they are just one thing, something that's very easy to describe. But actually, those 10 films are incredibly different, and she is the one who develops throughout. So her dance in the karaoke, it's fine, it's very good. But she spends a lot of time looking at the floor, and she's looking at Fred all throughout to help her, because he's the dance genius. And she is confident and sassy and a modern woman. And if you then compare that to the end of the sequence, her dance ability in the story of Vernon and Irene Castle, or even if you go forwards to the Barclays of Broadway,
which is a reunion from about 10 years later, 1949.
Exactly, yeah. So she's essentially had a first-hand training with Fred Astaire throughout that time, and Hermes Pan. I'm sure we'll come on to Hermes Pan later. And anyone having one-on-one classes with Hermes and Fred would improve and be an incredible dancer at the end of it. And so by the end of these 9 films, 10 films, her dancing ability is absolutely incredible, and it's really, really come on. And with that, the creatives writing these films develop her character, but the developments are based on things that were popular and worked for her character in the last film they did. So they're always kind of looking backwards to the last film, and they went, well, that worked, let's do that, but slightly different. Okay, that didn't work, but we'll take that element from that film and put it in here. And the Ginger you see in the story of Vernon and Irene Castle, which is a really confident actor, as well as a brilliant dancer, is very different from the Ginger you see who is getting by on her sass, rather than her dance chops, shall we say, in Flying Down to Rio. If you go back to, you mentioned the Busby Berkeley movies. So 42nd Street, she is really sassy, and she makes lots of sarcastic comments, and she's very showgirly. And the character of Anytime Annie is written that way. And she plays that character. At this point, she's not being Ginger Rogers.
No.
She's been turned up, she's been gun for hire, she's been asked to play Anytime Annie. Anytime Annie is sassy, she is sarcastic, and she's the one who, winks and rolls her eyes and is a gold digger and ends up with the producer at the end of the film.
But she's got heart, and I don't mean Roxy heart, because she's also, she does end up with Abner, the money man, if you like, who's not a theatre man and who's just thrown over Dorothy Brock, or has been thrown over by Dorothy Brock.
Yeah.
Touch of both. And he wants to promote her into the Dorothy Brock role when Dorothy becomes unavailable because she's fractured her ankle.
Yeah.
And the Anytime Annie character then also, at this moment, having been flattered, actually does speech marks the right thing and says, don't use me, use unbelievably, please use Ruby Keeler, which is a discussion for another
time
day.
in cinema history where Ruby Keeler was promoted for her dance abilities over Ginger Rogers.
Quite.
Yeah.
And possibly her acting abilities. I must be honest, I'm not a fan of Ruby, much more of a fan of Ginger. Well, I know it may be blasphemy.
Sacrosanct.
It is. But I genuinely, well, actually, we'll talk about this later, but, Ruby Keeler is too much the ingenue.
Well, Ruby Keeler said when she was filming Gold Diggers of 33...
The next film in the sequence.
Yeah, the sort of the follow-up. The team got back together and did another movie. And she said, she looked at Ginger and said she is going to be a massive star because she's got drive and I haven't. And she said, actually... I think there's more to life than being a film star.
And she did retire in her 40s, didn't she, Ruby Keeler? I think.
She did, yeah.
Yes.
She didn't actually make that many films. She had a tricky time with her husband, Al Jolson,
yes,
who was the big ego and wanted to be the film star and the big worldwide star at the time when his wife was being a bigger star than he was. It was very tricky for her to navigate those choppy waters. But I think there is something where Ruby Keeler, throughout her life, said, you know what, I wasn't much of a singer, dancer and actor. It was almost like she was in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the interesting thing about Keeler is, pretty much, she is the first female musicals dance star. Now, if you were to be the first anything, you would understand that people who come after you are going to be better.
That's true. Yes, yes. You become the archetype, but the people who follow on have a chance to recalibrate, remodulate, and make that better. I agree.
Absolutely.
But I would argue that Ginger Rogers is more versatile.
Well, no, I'm not saying so. I would say that Ruby Keeler's screen persona, why she works in that role, is because she is that role. She is the person who's not that talented, thrown into the main part, and it's that authenticity which you can see in her eyes. She's a bit scared being in this movie. The limelight sort of hits her face and she recoils from it a little bit. Whereas Roger's screen persona is always as an actor. People got a bit confused and thought that Fred and Ginger were an item. Well, we'll get to that. They sort of were once upon a time.
I didn't know that.
The secrets we're revealing today. But Rogers was a consummate actor. And what you see on the screen is a mask. And she is bringing herself to the role, of course. You'd have to. You have your own body and your own voice, etc. But it is her ability to replicate emotions that makes her the star and the incredible actor that she is, I think. Whereas Ruby Keeler was the girl next door who was giving it a go. And in the Great Depression era, when people had lost everything, they had no money, they could see themselves in Keeler.
She's the girl next door, then, in a way that Ginger Rogers isn't.
Oh, well, Ginger Rogers is the glamorous girl next door.
Yes. Well, she's the girl who's visiting the man next door, which is a very different status, I think.
Yeah, and so in Gold Diggers of 33, Ginger Rogers, again, she is playing a chorus girl who is sassy and, living up to all the stereotypes of what a Broadway chorus girl would have been like at the time. So she sings incredibly. She sings We're in the Money.
Right at the top of the film.
Right at the top of the film. And it's quite incredible. We talk about Fred's screen persona being jarring because it's so similar. What's incredible about watching Ginger on the big screen, her face 13 metres wide by 5 metres high. If you watch Gold Diggers of 33, that's how the film begins. Big close-ups of Ginger Rogers. It's how different she is.
Yes.
She looks like a puppy version of Ginger Rogers. It's like someone's in Ginger Rogers' skin, but not acting like Ginger Rogers. The confidence is there, but there's a polish that's lacking later on. And actually, she's kind of underused in the film. Her character ebbs away after that.
And she's a harder character than Anytime Annie. Because I think Anytime Annie, you can see some similarities, but actually I think she's more of a gold digger in Gold Diggers of 33, ironically, and is portrayed as within the female contingent of actresses and showgirls who are wanting to put on a show, but also, where they can, get one over on a couple of starchy gentlemen, some starchier than others, it has to be said. But she is the villain. She's not a villain because there is no villain per se, but she's harder. She's seen as the rival. She's seen as the one who might actually carry it through. She's the one who's sort of made to scram. Yeah, absolutely. And just seeing the difference between those two characters' performances shows you that she didn't have a concept of what her screen persona was at that point. So similarly, when you get to the glorious, happiest accident in all
film cinema, which is Fred being cast with Ginger in Flying Down to Rio. So originally Fred was to be partnered with another dancer. It wasn't originally Ginger.
Oh.
And she decided to marry the studio boss, Marion C. Cooper, instead of being in this film. So Ginger is a last-minute replacement. Now, Fred and Ginger knew each other because when Ginger was on stage in the stage version of Girl Crazy, 1932, Fred had been asked to come and re-choreograph some of the dances.
He's an old friend of George Gershwin, and Girl Crazy is a Gershwin show. So
absolutely,
that's the connection.
Yeah. So there's a Gershwin connection that runs through this, which is Gershwin and Fred were genuine friends. George and his brother wrote lots of material for Fred.
And you can hear George playing the piano on those early Brunswick recordings of Fred
absolutely,
Astaire.
with Fred and Adele.
Yeah.
When back in the day when it was Fred and Deli, as he called her. So they meet in this mezzanine in the theatre where Girl Crazy is being on. And basically the dance director wasn't very good, and they wanted to do something about the dance in the song that they were doing to Embraceable You, which was written for Ginger Rogers. People talk about the Fred Astaire songbook. Well, Embraceable You was written for Ginger Rogers. What's the other song from that show which was written for Ginger Rogers? Can't remember. But
yes, I'm afraid I can't help you there because I'm too busy thinking, because the other person who burst out of that cast is Ethel Merman.
Ethel Merman, who is cast
premiere
under Ginger Rogers' mother's advice. It was she who says, why don't you pick this woman up to play
Ethel
this part?
Zimmerman.
Yeah, exactly.
She dropped a zim, and look where she went.
She dropped it, yeah, she just became Merman.
Zim, 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 rhythm lead your race. No, that's a different musical.
Different musical, we'll get to that one.
We will.
So there is a George Gershwin and Fred Astaire link, but what lots of people don't realise is that there's a Ginger Rogers and Gershwin link as well.
Yes.
So
I can tell you probably know this, both Fred and his wife and Ginger Rogers went to George Gershwin's funeral. And you might say, well, that's not that surprising, but there was only so much room. They were actually in the service.
Yeah, right. That's really interesting. Yeah, so Fred and George had a friendship, but also Ginger, well, it's quite difficult. In her biography, she talks about going out with George. Now, I don't know if that is as friends or whether it's dating. She's quite her language is quite coy.
Yes.
Yeah, but potentially there was something there between them.
Well, do you know the story that she relates in her autobiography about, because George was also an amateur painter of some distinction. You'll know this one, where they went into a paint shop, and she'd been interested in looking at some artistry and some artist materials. She leaves the shop for some reason. He comes out a bit later and gives her a present of a painting set, essentially, so that she can, but she doesn't open it until after George has passed away, and inside it she discovers that he's popped in a little sort of a sketch that he's done of her, because he was actually rather a good artist. Yeah. And she goes on to say, this is one of my great treasured possessions, but she felt guilty, but she'd never been in a position to thank him for it. I'm sure you're aware of the story, but it's a lovely moment of friendship. That's two people who know each other as friends, not as colleagues.
Absolutely, and that comes across really nicely in how she writes that, and also the wonderful element where he is painting and she's watching him and she says, "Oh, I'd like to draw something." Do you know this one?
No, I don't know.
It's just a little bit before, and he says, "Oh, I'm busy," and she says, "Oh, I'd like to draw a picture of you." And I said, "Well, go out into the hallway. There's a stand there. There's some photos. Take a photo from there and draw and try and draw what you can." And she picks this photo up, but it's not George, it's Irving Berlin.
Oh!
So she has the chutzpah to draw a picture of Irving Berlin in George Gershwin's house while he's painting next door. So Fred and Ginger...
It's also interesting, isn't it, that George Gershwin's got I know they were friends, Irving Berlin and George Gershwin, but it's interesting that he's got a picture of Irving.
Isn't it?
Up in his house.
Yeah, and George would describe him as a rival, but, they don't... Yeah, there's obviously a lot of respect between the two of them. But to go back to this mezzanine, so Fred and Ginger meet for the first time in this mezzanine. She knows who he is. He's got a big reputation by that point. So for 20-odd years, Fred has been the partner of his sister Adele. Now, Fred is always spoken of. There's no film that exists, but there's plenty of written evidence that Fred was the junior partner in that dancing pair. She was the one people came to see. Now, from what you can gather, she was much more of a comic. I don't know why, but she makes me think of someone like Gracie Allen, as someone who can dance, but is a sort of comic.
Well, it's interesting because she turns up in A Damsel in Distress.
She does.
So there is an avatar.
Yeah.
Yes.
And with music by George Gershwin.
Yes.
Adele and Fred are huge stars, feted in New York and London.
They know the Prince of Wales.
And Fred dresses with sort of English flair with an English tailor. And as you can imagine, if you dance with your sister, that doesn't give you many opportunities to dance romantic duets. So actually, I think that those 20-odd years that Adele and Fred are dancing together, Fred is only using part of his dance emotion, dance experience, or dance capabilities because he's dancing with someone who has to be his sister or his friend. It would be very strange if they danced a romantic duet. Now, he did do a romantic duet with other people, but those other people weren't partners. They weren't people he'd been with for 20 years, yet alone shared DNA. So Ginger finds him at this point where he is a big star, and they get to know each other, and they go on a couple of dates. So he picks her up, they go to a nightclub, they dance around. She describes the kiss that they share in his car as being something that wouldn't pass the Hayes office.
Oh, crikey, right, full on then, is it?
Yeah. And there is some writing that looks at her description of that event period. They go out on a few dates, which says, look, clearly there was a little bit more to it than just kissing. But by the time they meet together in Hollywood, he's different. She describes him as being a bit standoffish and like someone he doesn't know. And he says to her, well, I'm married now. So in the meantime, he's got married, he's very different and, a bit stiff and starchy. But Fred has been scarred by his experience of being second fiddle to his sister. And his sister then gives up showbiz just after he's met Ginger.
Well, she marries into the aristocracy, doesn't she?
She marries into the aristocracy, the British aristocracy.
Do you know the fabulous story, just a step here, sorry, Adele, she enjoyed her life in the aristocracy and sort of settled into it, but she retained her, what I might call vaudevillian sense of humour, her comedic. Are you aware of the cushions that she embroidered?
Go for it.
Well, apparently in the house, she would spend time embroidering cushions as a hobby and things like that. And Fred came to visit one day and said, I'm quite surprised to find you doing this, what appears to be not that, it's so far removed from your theatrical career and experience and your personality. And she turned it over and she'd embroidered on the back. Pardon my language.
Brilliant. Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. She was sort of like a Trojan horse in British aristocracy and sort of poking the pomposity from the inside, which is a lot like Fred's screen persona does that a little bit as well.
Well, I think we need to talk about classlessness, both class and classlessness in one for both of them.
Well, that is an interesting, we'll definitely come back to that because there's lots to say about their different approach to class because of what their relatively humble starts were for both of them. But Fred's aspiration versus Ginger's from her mother sort of, I don't know if you'd call it reality, but her sort of not wanting to aspire to a different class, to stay in the class she was. So we're back in this mezzanine. So they're dating, and they bump into each other at an after-show party for something, I can't remember what. And then Ginger says, do you know what, it was great meeting you, Fred, but I'm off to Hollywood. I'm going to make movies. But of course, this was at a time when they were making films in New York. So she'd been based in New York, doing her Broadway work during the evening, but making films in New York for Paramount between 30 and...
These are the first few in her career before she hits it with Warner Brothers.
Yes, exactly. But the big films are being made out in Los Angeles. So she said, right, I'm going off to make it big in films, and off she goes. So Fred... Then his sister Adele retires, and Fred is going, right, well, I have now got my opportunity to prove that me and me alone, I've got the talent, I've got the star charisma, I can do this. So Fred wants to prove that he can do, be a star on his own without his sister, and he is in a stage show called The Gay Divorce, with music by Cole Porter.
On stage?
On stage in New York and London.
But what I mean is that it has a Cole Porter score on stage. It doesn't have...
Exactly, yes. This is the stage.
It only has one surviving Cole Porter song in the film. But
well, the film is The Gay Divorcee.
Yes.
And The Gay Divorce has the Cole Porter score. So Fred... There's a lot of press coverage of this show, especially in London, that goes, we were really worried about Fred being on his own without Adele, because we all love Adele. She's a huge star in London, and actually he's done really well. Well done, Fred. You've managed it. And he's the full-on romantic lead, I think, for the first time, which is an experience for Fred, which has given how brilliant he is at what he does, it's quite interesting to think of Fred trying anything for the first time, let alone being nervous about it.
That's fair. I mean, funny enough, I was very taken with what you were saying about the fact that he and Adele are a sister and brother act, and had to be written that way when they were performing together, because there is a stage show from that era which still gets done today, which is Lady Be Good.
Yeah.
And in it, they are a brother and sister. And what's interesting is that the Adele character goes off and has all the comic, she has to pretend to be someone else for Wally Watkins, the principal comedian. So the comedian and comedienne, to use the old phrases, where Fred goes off and has the relationship, as it were. So he does have a romantic role, but of course, he's not the star. You're right. They've gone to the comic is still, the Adele role is bigger than the Fred role, but it has to be written as brother and sisters going off.
Yeah.
So I'm merely underlining what you're saying, but you can see it if you ever get a chance to see Lady Be Good.
Yeah, absolutely. And Ginger's star power is very different to Fred. Even post her 42nd Street and Gold Diggers exposure, I'm not sure you'd be able to pick her out in a crowd.
No.
People wouldn't have, had the Ginger Rogers fan club at that point. So it's kind of it's luck that she steps in at the last minute. It's quite 42nd Streety, and that she steps into the karaoke at the last minute. So the karaoke in Flying Down to Rio. So
By Vincent Youmans.
By Vincent Youmans, yeah, who was suffering with tuberculosis at the time. Interesting.
She killed him, I think, didn't it?
He
Ultimately,
did,
about 10
only
years
a few
later.
years later.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing about Vincent Youmans is people talk about Jerome Kern, Irving Berlin, Cole Porter, the Gershwins in the same breath. But Vincent Youmans, and to a degree...
Rodgers and Hart?
Rodgers and Hart in the same breath as those other guys. Henderson, Brown and Silver. Henderson, De Silva and Brown. To a degree then, Henderson, De Silva and Brown hit the ground running a little bit earlier and have commercial success, and they're not really they sort of are a writing team, but one of them goes off to be the head of film production, and the other two kind of try their best without him. But Vincent Youmans is interesting because he becomes really sick and doesn't really get the opportunity to contribute to the golden era of sort of 20th century popular song because he's so sick. But what he did manage is incredible. So T for Two, that's Vincent Youmans, isn't it?
And lyrics by Irving Caesar, who's an early non-Ira Gershwin lyricist for Gershwin.
Indeed.
Yeah. I think he does work. I think Vincent Youmans, however, does work in 1936 for the Ziegfeld Follies of 1936, which is a stage show with Ira Gershwin lyrics. I think,
Sure.
Because Ira still worked with other people.
Yeah.
But and that the big song from that is I Can't Get Started, which is another fabulous song. But you're right. But he's not remembered as being in the mainstream of the greats, even though he clearly was, but just because of his output. Yes,
absolutely. And
but he's still referenced. Sorry, he's referenced in an Irving Berlin lyric. Is it an Irving Berlin
it's
lyric?
Cole Porter, but
talented humans like Vincent Youmans. Yes.
It's, you're the top.
Oh, well, of course it is. Yes, thank you.
But that's a really good point because it shows you how well thought of he was at the time. Yeah. So they have these songs by Vincent Youmans, and there's a really interesting through line here, which is about the Fred and Ginger movies start with Flying Down to Rio, RKO, and they end with another flying themed movie, which is the story of Vernon and Irene Castle, in which Fred is killed in a plane crash. And if you kind of look at that as the RKO arch, you kind of...
The arch KO.
The arch KO of the stories, you sort of realise that getting off the ground and flying is a theme that you can see throughout. So a lot of their dances, they start on the floor, they're sat down, or they're in chairs, and they get up. And when Fred
Flying Down, that's exactly how it starts. He turns around and hears the orchestra, doesn't he? And he grabs Ginger, stands up and says,
"Let's give it a go. Yeah, let's show them what we can do." And it's the music and the dance which takes you to another level. And Fred sings "Heaven, I'm in Heaven," and he's telling you where he is at that point, and you're with him, and you fly with Fred and Ginger. And when they finish, you come back down to earth. And so many of their dance numbers end in that way, with them coming back down to earth, like a record, slowly, coming to the end of its. What would you say? What's the word? When you wind up a record.
And it winds down,
like a record winding down.
Can I say there's a really interesting step in Let's Face the Music and Dance is from Follow the Fleet. It's the finale at that, and
Yeah.
it's a performance in a show, and it's quite dark in its way. I mean, it's obviously been now attributed as being a kind of sort of a pathetic song about the end of the gaiety of the 1930s with Nazi Germany and the war, etc. But even within the piece, the two, Fred and Ginger are playing characters who have just both contemplated committing suicide.
Yeah.
They dance. But to take it down to your point about coming back down to earth, so this elevates them from them, either shooting themselves or throwing themselves off a bridge. But the very last step, they sort of step out from the curtains, they do a very strange dip, which is, to me, is almost the archetypal Art Deco move, because actually they sort of arch their body and they look like they become part of the Art Deco, the magnificent Art Deco scenery and architecture of the period, as well as actually taking place at that moment. But they do this really unexpected step, but it brings them closer to the ground. So I'm absolutely echoing what you're saying, but there is that kind of, and it's in the Gay Divorce, isn't it? When it's Night and Day, in fact, the one Cole Porter song that survives, which is, if you like, the song where Fred's character romances Ginger's character, and it's the one where at the end he sort of deposits her in a chair after this magnificent dance.
Yeah.
And actually offers her a cigarette, I think, which is, it's post-coital.
It's very post-coital.
But she sits down.
Correct me if I'm wrong, is that the one where he does the hands brushing together gesture?
Yes, I think so.
Which is a bit like, hey, look at me, guys, look what I've managed to do. Which hopefully he was able to iron out of his screen persona as time went on. But yeah, absolutely.
But you were talking about being raised and coming back down.
Yeah, and I think
elevation through dance.
It really is. And when you realise that, you leave the cinema at the end of a Fred and Ginger movie, you're walking on air, but you feel, real life isn't like this, and it's awful.
It certainly was in the 30s, sorry.
Oh, well, absolutely, yeah. And that's what, that image in Flying Down to Rio of getting up in a plane and having chorus girls on it, it is a joke.
Preposterous.
It is preposterous, it is sort of ridiculous, but actually as an image, it works really well throughout the whole thing, the theme of the films. And it's one of those things that, however different these films are, it's something that links them all together, because they are completely wildly different. And it's a really interesting thing in research of Fred and Ginger. There's a lot of academic and biographical writing about them, and lots of people say, well, there's 7 Fred and Ginger movies, and some people say, well, there's 9 Fred and Ginger movies. And it's like, no,
there's 10.
There are 10 films which star Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. You cannot tell me, just because you don't think that the story of Vernon and Irene Castle is not in the spirit of a Fred and Ginger movie, you've misunderstood what the spirit of a Fred and Ginger movie is.
Couldn't agree more.
The fact is, it has to star Fred Astaire with Ginger Rogers. And there are 10 films. You can't discount Flying Down to Rio because they're in it.
Yes.
And, misunderstanding that Vernon and Irene Castle is part of that. Think about the theme of flight and up and down, and the fact that to be able to chart Ginger's dance, her dance experience and technique and expertise getting better. So if you just think, Vernon and Irene Castle is just a showpiece for various other dances, it's not Fred and Ginger. Well, it is, because look how well they are dancing together. Look how well she is acting in that film. Look how well they're both acting in that film, how they work together.
We should say it's a biopic here, just for clarification.
It's a biopic, yeah. And the interesting thing I think about that, so we've got 10 films. We start in 1933, we finish in 39 for RKO. We've got a 10-year gap until we come back for MGM with the Barclays of Broadway. Those final 2 movies, they're married in. So they get married a little bit of the way into Vernon and Irene Castle. And if you then look at Vernon and Irene Castle and say, well, that's not a Fred Astaire movie, because a Fred and Ginger movie, because they're married. Well, think about it in the context. By the time you've spent, 15 hours watching these they're watching these actors on the screen, you don't buy the fact that they're strangers anymore.
No,
you can't. So by the 9th movie, they're going to be married at the start. And if you think about that in terms of the plot the plot arc of all the films together, they know each other better as the films go on at the start, because you buy into their star power and their star screen personas. And by the time you get to the last movie, 10 years after, not only are they married, but they're bitching and they're rowing, just like a couple would.
Yes, it's naturalistic in that sense. I think, you've hit a very... I think every point you've made so far has been absolutely fabulous. And I agree with you that it is easy to take the Fred and Ginger canon as a canon and then make it, and then argue that they're formulaic. And at one level, of course, they are, because there are so many recurring features. And there's a kind of repertory company to a number of them, not all of them. And they're not all in the same repertory, different people at different times, like the Carry On films in that sense, oddly.
I have had that very thought, and I describe anything of that ilk. I described like a carry-on film because it's got a company.
But just watching them in sequence, which of course isn't how they were. Well, they were made in sequence, but they weren't watched in short sequence. There's a few months between them, or a year or two. I think it's 2 or 3 a year for the most part. But it's in Flying Down to Rio, they're the secondary couple. And there's very clearly that they're already friends. Their relationship is forged in that one already, because when you join them, they are both part of the group, which is ostensibly led by the hero, because they are the secondary comic couple.
Yeah.
But they hang around together. For all intents and purposes, they're boyfriend and girlfriend. That's certainly what it looks like. In the gay divorce, you've got the more traditional thing where she's slightly standoffish to him when he makes advances, and then he has to win her over the course of things. So they're not known to each other, and they're the primary couple. Then you get to Roberta, and they're the secondary couple again, because you've got Irene Dunn and, I have to say, really rather wooden Randolph Scott, in my opinion. I don't understand the appeal of him, to be honest, and we're going to get more of him in Follow the Fleet. But it's interesting. It feels strangely retrospective, but it's different again. I suppose if you look at it by saying, this is not them doing the same thing each time, they're doing it slightly differently. So in Roberta, they're old friends, and now living, she's masquerading as a countess and performer in Paris, and Fred finds her by accident. And then you've got Top Hat, where they're antagonistic again. One is Fred is dancing and Ginger's in the room beneath in the hotel wanting some quiet, and not a tap dancer above her. And then you go to Follow the Fleet, and once again their former boyfriend and girlfriend who have split up and then get back together again. But in this, I think this is a remarkable film actually, Follow the Fleet. But they're sort of the secondary couple again, oddly, because this time you've got it's Randolph Scott again, and I was terrible. I can't now remember the woman. She's a much better actress, but she's not a better singer.
Oh no, the sister.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, plays Shari, I think. Okay. So they're the secondary couple again with the mightily wooden Randolph Scott, who actually acts terribly. But I don't just mean acts terribly. His character acts terribly to the heroine who falls in love with him, the ingenue character again. Yeah. But they're the secondary couple. But this time, Fred's playing a very different character. He's a sort of he smokes. He's rude. Gum. Sorry, he chews gum. Yes, I mean, and he walks. Not unlike John Wayne off his horse kind of thing. There's a kind of rolling swagger to it. But also he's become a proper American sailor rating with the mannerisms you might expect from that. And he actually, there's a kind of redemption, which is he breaks, he goes AWOL, essentially, to redeem some of the characters and himself. But he does it through breaking the rules. And so he's very different. But also I think Ginger's very different in that. So I suppose what I'm trying to say quite badly is there's 2 or 3 different options available to a couple, which they use differently each time. So I'm absolutely underlying what you're saying, which is that watching one Fred and Ginger film is not the same as watching another Fred and Ginger film. And they've all got different feels. They've all got different positions in the cast, although they're obviously all Fred and Ginger films after the first one. They share top billing or have top billing. But it's interesting that there's sometimes a secondary couple, there's sometimes the comedy couple, there's sometimes the sincere couple. They do both. I'm always fascinated by the fact I think it's quite difficult to see, and I'm using the terms ingenue and soubrette, which is a theatrical term, but Ruby Keeler is an ingenue. She's sort of sweet. She's almost simpering. You would take one look at Ginger, I think, and say soubrette. But soubrettes often, they're not just comedy, but they've often got more versatile acting chops, and it's easier for a soubrette to go off and do things. And I think that's one of her great skills, that it's easy to underestimate a great comic actor like Ginger Rogers, who is more than being just a great comic actor, but that is some way, she's often presented that way. Yeah. I'm rambling now, so I'm going to ask you a totally different question. I've read somewhere, and I thought this was such an interesting thing, that Ginger Rogers was not a great dancer, but she was an actress who was able to act being a great dancer. Discuss.
Okay, that is interesting. So I think, generally, to repeat slightly what we were talking about before, I think at the end of the sequence she is an incredible dancer because she's had the best tuition. She didn't go into film as a dancer. I mean, she could dance. She was supposedly the Charleston champion of the world.
At 14 or something, wasn't she?
Exactly. But you can see how much of a better dancer she is at the end of this process. And it's interesting as well to look at her dance abilities in Barclays of Broadway, where she hasn't danced for 10 years. And Fred's done nothing but dance for 10 years, and she's much stiffer.
Although that sort of tends towards middle age anyway. I know they're still youngish,
absolutely.
but it works with the relationship.
Totally. It works with the narrative of the movie. I don't think it's fair to say she was a bad dancer at all. I think she's incredible. Anyone next to Fred Astaire is going to look not as good as Fred Astaire. But when you say dance, what are you talking about? So Fred was merging ballet, ballroom and tap. And Ginger's tap may not have been up to Fred's tap, but very few people's tap was up to Fred's tap.
Although she does get a solo in Follow the Fleet, and she's pretty good. She's auditioning for Morgan, the impresario.
I think the sound has a lot to do with
Oh, well, someone in the background tapping on a bit of hardwood. Yeah,
the taps and it's a great routine, and she's very, very good in it.
But there's no obvious cuts, so it looks like a one-taker.
It is, yeah, you're absolutely right. But I think it's Hermes Pan's taps, and they're very, very loud. They don't match with the delicacy of the shoe. And that, for me, that mismatch is a missed opportunity. But yeah, her taps were dubbed, mostly by Hermes Pan. Fred did them sometimes. But I think that takes away from what dance is. And what Fred and Ginger are doing together is ballroom and ballet as well as the tap. And it may well be, if you look closely, maybe Ginger fluffs a few taps here and there. But there was this thing someone said once about the two drummers, Gene Krupa and Buddy Rich, who was the best. And the quote goes, Buddy Rich was the best, but you looked at Gene Krupa.
That's very interesting.
And it's the similar kind of thing. It doesn't really matter how good she is in an exam kind of way. You're not marking Ginger for that. She has the most incredible style and elegance. And without her, Fred is a very different screen double act. He never was able to recapture what he had with Ginger, that chemistry.
Even with professional dancers, and I'm using the word professional wrapped around speech marks. So Sid Charisse is the one who's often identified as being the best technical dancer, and there's no doubting that Sid Charisse is an elegant dancer and brilliant and versatile, although more ballet, I think, than contemporary, but she could do both.
Yeah.
And Fred dances her in two films, Bandwagon being one of them, which is one of the great films as far as I'm concerned. And yet, I find her performance alongside Fred so much less enjoyable, and I'm going to use enjoyment as the judgment. So I'm with you. I think Fred is never more enjoyable in a dance routine than he is with Ginger, and vice versa.
Yeah, it's funny because Fred he was an incredibly shy person. He couldn't look at himself in rushes. He hated watching himself on the screen, and for all his incredible abilities as a dancer, he was incredibly insecure. So it was useful to him to have Hermes Pan, who was his assistant choreographer on all the Fred and Ginger movies.
They're almost co-muses for each other, I think, in some senses.
Yeah, and they look really similar.
Yes.
Have a look online, get up a picture of Hermes Pan, and you go, oh, that's like happy, confident Fred Astaire. They even dressed alike. So now we're going down the Hermes Pan
rabbit hole.
Let's talk about Hermes. So Hermes Pan was assisting dance director David Gould on Flying Down to Rio. Fred was having a bit of trouble with, I think, working out his solo for Music Makes Me, which is a wonderful solo he has, where a band is playing a song and Fred is trying to talk to his group of chorines, and he can't help but dance to this song. It's like his feet have shoes with wings on, which is something that was explored later on in Barclays of Broadway.
Although the lyric of Music Makes Me is exactly that, isn't it?
Music makes me do the things I never should do.
My self-control was something to brag about. Now it's a gag about town.
Exactly. So Hermes Pan comes over, helps him out with a step. He has a break that he's picked up, and that is as important a professional relationship as Fred and Ginger's professional relationship. Because Ginger Rogers was off doing films, lots of films, 12 films within the period that they were together, not with Fred, on her own. And she didn't have time to rehearse or make the dance. So Hermes and Fred made the dance. It took them 6 weeks, maybe even longer. And Ginger would come in at the end period. Generally what would happen is Hermes would dance Ginger with Fred in the rehearsal room, and then Hermes would dance Fred with Ginger to get her up to speed. And he's the missing link here.
Is there a famous bit of rehearsal footage where he's dancing as Ginger with Fred in one of these sort of creative moments, and he's got a veil on his head?
So it's a cut number called Me and the Ghost Upstairs. Oh God, I can't remember what it's called. Something in the Ghost Upstairs. Me and the Ghost Upstairs. But if you watch
there's a Fred Astaire song of that. Certainly,
exactly.
He cut a recording in the 40s. Certainly,
yeah. So that was filmed for
one of them.
One of the films. I think something like You'll Never Get Rich. I think. In that footage, Hermes is the ghost, and Hermes is in heels.
Ah, fine. That's what the veil is.
Yeah, so he's being a ghost and he's wearing heels. So it shows you.
It's my favourite kind of ghost, to be honest.
Yeah, a ghost in heels. Who wouldn't love a ghost in heels? So without that support, Fred would not have been able to achieve what he did. I know we had a point originally. We were talking about Ginger being an acting dancer. So I think it is very unfair to say she's not a good dancer. She is an incredible dancer.
And she's fun to watch.
She is so much fun because she is enjoying herself. Or we think she's enjoying herself. And the key, I think, to Ginger's success is that in those routines, she is able to fabricate love of Fred, amazement of Fred, being beguiled by Fred, and that is what makes it work. Fred is Fred, whatever he does.
Yes.
It's a bit like, I think, John Lennon is John Lennon. In all the things he does, he's John Lennon. Paul McCartney is a chameleon. He can work with a certain genre, he can do classic, he can do all of this. John Lennon plays John Lennon music. Fred Astaire did Fred Astaire dance. Whereas Ginger, and the acting here isn't just saying lines and, giving the emotion that is needed. It's that she dances what Fred needs to be danced with in a way that I don't think Sid Charisse would have been able to or intuitively understand. Sid Charisse is incredible, and she's got a huge presence, and she's an incredible ballet dancer.
But are they simpatico?
But exactly.
Yeah, and simpatico is the word.
It absolutely is. And I think one of the things is perhaps they were former lovers, and there was a little spark there that you can see. And this is the funny thing, I think, about the Fred films, is that you have these creative teams who write the script, the story, they get directed, you have the production, you have the dresses, you have the songs, all of this. And what none of them can create is that spark. No one can explain what that spark is. And it looks genuine and authentic. Now, if it isn't, people found it very hard to believe they weren't lovers in real life, that they were married to other people. And if that's the case, and there wasn't a genuine spark there, it's Ginger Rogers who is able to act that spark that makes it happen, I think.
Musical talk. And there we are. That was the first half of the conversation with the marvellous Miles Eady about Ginger Rogers. And I very much hope that you enjoyed it and that you want to hear more, because there's plenty more to say. And one of the reasons for that is because Ginger Rogers was such an amazingly talented actress. And the people with whom she collaborated were also enormous talents of the period. Even as you heard in that conversation, within the limited part of her career which was about musical film, she worked with Busby Berkeley, Fred Astaire, Irving Berlin, George Gershwin, Cole Porter, Jerome Kern, Vincent Youmans, and Dorothy Fields, another amazing talent from that period. And also with actors like Dick Powell, Dolores Del Rey, Ruby Keeler, Joan Blondell, and Irene Dunne, not to mention Randolph Scott, so I'm not going to if I can avoid it. Now, I do hope you'll join us again next week to hear more from that conversation with Miles, but don't forget there's also the fabulous BFI film series, Ginger Rogers and All That Sass, which is focused mostly on the BFI South Bank, sometimes known as the National Film Theatre. The first item in the series actually is Gold Diggers of 1933, which can be seen on the 27th of March. Now that actually replaces 42nd Street, which you may still find in the printed programme for this series, but actually due to rights issues issues. We're getting Gold Diggers of 1933 instead. However, that is a magnificent Busby Berkeley film, and you do get to see Ginger Rogers in one of her early film roles. And other films which may be of particular interest are Shall We Dance, which is the Gershwin Ginger and Fred film. That's showing on a number of occasions, including on the 8th of April at 2 o'clock, which is Easter Saturday. And with it comes an extra illustrated talk by Miles Eady, which I hope will be an additional draw to the film itself, which is fabulous. There's a chance to see The Barkleys of Broadway, which is their 1949 reunion film. And of course Top Hat, which for many people is the high watermark of the Ginger and Fred series at RKO. But there's a great deal more beside that. You can see Roxy Hart, the film that she made based on the 1926 play Chicago, which of course is the name it's also known as today as a musical. You can see Kitty Foyle, the film that won her an Oscar, and plenty of others like Lady in the Dark, Black Widow, the comedy Bachelor Mother, and Stage Door. And again, that film's being shown more than once, but if you go on the 2nd of April, you'll see an introduction by Sandy Toksvig. And it's not just films, because there's also a discussion panel called Backwards and in High Heels. That's on the 30th of March. There's a free Introduction to Ginger Rogers event for people who are 25 years old or under. That's on the 12th of April. And there's actually a course about Ginger Rogers called City Lit at the BFI, Ginger Rogers and All That Sass, which is a course examining the cultural and cinematic impact of Ginger Rogers. Do go along to the BFI website to find out more, and that's bfi.org.uk. And if you want to find out more about Miles Eady, and I do hope that you will because he's an interesting man, you can go to his website, which is mileseady, E-A-D-Y by the way, .com. It's a symphony in yellow at the moment, and you can find out more about what he's doing and what he's done in the past. And of course, you can hear more from Miles next week here on Musical Talk as we finish the fascinating conversation about the career of Ginger Rogers, and particularly the musicals of the 1930s in which she appeared, and which she now in so many ways represents. Do please join me again next week to hear the second part of that Ginger Rogers conversation. I'm absolutely certain you'll enjoy it. And do consider going along to the BFI and see some of the films and talks and panel discussions about the amazing Ginger Rogers. So, until next week, there's only one word I think fitting left for me to say. I'm sure you've guessed it already. Here it comes. Goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk, edited and presented by Thos Ribbits. Copyright Musical Talk 2023. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can at Musical Talk Thos. No, I fall squarely into the Rogers, Berlin, Kern. Basically, actually, I think by chance, Fred and Ginger get half the best songs from that era in their musicals anyway. So.
I mean, my interest in music started exactly with that. And I sort of fell into a slightly later period because you had later jazz artists recording that and reimagining those songs.
The standards as today. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was that reinterpret. So I came to it through someone would do I Got Rhythm or something, and it would be Charlie Parker. And it'd be, oh, hang on, I get this. I get what Charlie Parker's doing because I love the original.
You've said all the right things.
Great, I'm glad to hear it.